Hello, my name is Paula Perez. I am the product manager of CAMECA IMS7F Auto mass spectrometer. CAMECA is, as you may know, a manufacturer of magnetic sector SIMS instruments. This talk will show different applications of dynamic SIMS to the study of nuclear materials. This work is the result of a collaboration between CAMECA and several users of our instruments from different labs worldwide working in the nuclear science field. I would like to thank all my co-authors for providing this data and for their contribution to this work. After a brief introduction, I will show different examples of dynamic SIMS applications for the characterization of nuclear materials, in particular for the study of diffusion and segregation processes in materials used in nuclear reactors. In order to simulate the chemical behavior of fission products in nuclear materials, SIMS analyses were performed on different materials after ion implantation with natural isotopes of high fission yield species, such as molybdenum, helium, xenon, iodine. Before concluding, I will show another important application in the nuclear field, which is the characterization of nuclear particles collected in nuclear facilities for the control of nuclear activities. A brief introduction about the SIMS technique and instrumentation. When a solid sample is sputtered by primary ions of a few keV energy, a fraction of the particles emitted from the target is ionized. Secondary ion mass spectrometry, SIMS, consists of analyzing the secondary ions with a mass spectrometer. SIMS is a destructive technique by its nature, as it is based on sputtering of material. SIMS provides a local analysis of any type of solid material that can be kept under vacuum. Both elemental and isotopic information can be obtained for all species in the periodic table, from hydrogen to uranium and above. Static SIMS uses very low primary ion dose and focuses on the first top monolayers, providing mostly molecular characterization. Time-of-flight mass spectrometers are well adapted for static SIMS analysis. Dynamic SIMS mode is based on continuous, high-dose primary ion bombardment and thus provides bulk composition and in-depth distribution of trace elements over depth ranges that can vary between few nanometers to tens of micrometers, depending on the analytical conditions. Measurements are performed using reactive species, which guarantees high sensitivity, thus low detection limits, that reach the ppb level for many elements. A wide variety of analyses can be performed: depth profiles, isotope ratio analysis, ion imaging. Best performance for dynamic SIMS measurements is obtained using magnetic sector mass analyzers. All measurements shown in this talk have been performed using the CAMECA IMS7F or IMS7F Auto, which are magnetic sector mass analyzers dedicated to dynamic SIMS measurements. This sketch shows the operating mode for these type of instruments. The design of the CAMECA IMS tools is based on a continuous primary ion beam bombardment as well as on a continuous secondary ion extraction, DC mode. The DC mode, combined with a strong extraction field for the secondary ion collection, allows to optimize the instrumental transmission and thus to achieve low detection limits. Two primary ion sources are available: cesium for the analysis of electronegative species and oxygen for analyzing electropositive species. The secondary ions, which are characteristic of the composition of the analyzed area, are collected and then separated in a magnetic sector analyzer according to their mass. The CAMECA double focusing mass spectrometer design is based on the coupling of the magnetic sector with an electrostatic sector for efficient mass separation. These instruments work in monocollection mode, secondary ions being acquired one by one by scanning the magnetic field. 2 detectors are available, one electromultiplier for lower count rates and one Faraday cup for higher count rates. A brief introduction to the study of nuclear materials. The nuclear fuel used in nuclear power reactors is manufactured in rods containing cylindrical fuel pellets stacked in a long cladding made of a zirconium-based alloy. During irradiation, the uranium and plutonium atoms are transformed by nuclear reaction either into fission products, for instance molybdenum, iodine, xenon, or other actinides. In addition, the energy produced by fission in the uranium dioxide ceramic induces a huge thermal gradient in the pellet that strongly affects the chemical behavior of the elements within the ceramic. Dynamic SIMS is considered to be a major analytical technique for nuclear materials characterization and is complementary to other techniques used in this field, such as EPMA. This first set of data focuses on the study of molybdenum in uranium dioxide. The Fukushima accident has revealed the vulnerability of nuclear facilities and has shown how important it is to better understand the mechanisms that occur during a reactor accident. Reactor accidents are characterized by significant release of fission products. We can see here the variation of the fission yield versus mass. During reactor accidents, there is also a significant temperature increase. Molybdenum is a high-yield fission product. It presents a complex chemistry, has a low solubility in UO2, and is known to affect the behavior of other fission products depending on temperature and partial pressure of oxygen. The objective of this SIMS study was to investigate the temperature effect on molybdenum migration in UO2 with and without interaction with other fission products. We can see here schematically different types of migration processes that may occur: diffusion, transport, or volatilization. In this study, molybdenum depth profiling measurements were performed in a polycrystalline UO2 sample with an average grain size around 10 microns. The samples were ion implanted with 95 MO ions. Depth profiling measurements were performed on a CAMECA IMS-7F using O2 plus primary bombardment at 5 keV impact energy and collecting positive secondary ions. The duration of the depth profile acquisition was around 30 minutes. The first depth profiling measurement performed in this sample using classic conditions, that is, with a static sample stage, has shown the presence of a significant roughness at the greater bottom, as can be seen in the optical interferometer image. Surface roughness development during sputtering is a well-known process that degrades the depth resolution of SIMS measurements. This has been demonstrated especially for polycrystalline materials like metals, so it is likely also to occur in UO2 polycrystalline samples. Rotation of the sample during analysis is expected to minimize this roughness development effect. Can it work here? The principle of the Eucentric rotating stage is shown here. In the reference position of the sample holder, the sample stage origin O coincides with the axis of the mass spectrometer S. For selecting the analysis area, the sample is translated to make the selected analysis point coincide with the mass spectrometer axis S. The rotation is eucentric because the axis of rotation coincides with the axis of the mass spectrometer as shown here. Two sets of analyses are compared here without and with rotation of the sample during sputtering. Measurements with rotation were performed using a rotation speed of 15 RPM. As expected, without rotation, greater depth measurements using an optical interferometer have shown the presence of significant roughness at the crater bottom, with ripples of amplitude close to 1 micron. For the set of measurements performed while rotating the sample analysis, greater depth measurements show that the crater bottom is significantly flatter, confirming that the sample rotation could efficiently minimize the roughening effects. In addition, repeated MO depth profiling measurements performed without sample rotation show a large scatter of the data with a high variation in the measured dose values, whereas a much better repeatability between different runs is obtained for measurements performed with sample rotation. Data show that Eucentric sample rotation during SIMS analysis is an efficient method to minimize surface roughness development in UO2 polycrystalline samples, thus significantly improving depth profiling data reproducibility. Additional measurements have been performed using sample rotation on MO and/or cesium-implanted polycrystalline UO2 samples in order to study the temperature effect on MO migration with and without interaction with other fission products such as cesium. Detailed data will be presented in a coming paper. The next example shows measurements of helium depth profiles in tungsten samples. Due to helium's extreme low solubility in most metallic materials, helium strongly interacts with pre-existing and radiation-induced defects, leading to void swelling, hardening, creep fracture, blistering, and surface exfoliation. In order to ensure longevity of the structural nuclear materials, it is thus of great importance to better understand helium diffusion mechanisms, as well as to describe its distribution below the surface. The goal of this analysis was to evaluate depth profiling capabilities when analyzing helium in tungsten samples in terms of depth resolution and detection limit. Analyses were performed on 6 tungsten film samples irradiated with helium ions at different fluences and temperatures. A previous study has shown that the cesium primary ion bombardment, coupled with the detection of cesium-helium plus molecular ions, is an efficient method to overcome the very low helium ionization yield, thus providing optimized sensitivity. Medium mass resolution conditions were selected in order to improve the abundance sensitivity of the mass spectrometer. In fact, there is a background signal that affects the measurement of the cesium-helium signal due to the tail of the neighboring cesium peak, which has a very high intensity. A slightly increase of the mass resolution allows to decrease this background contribution while keeping good transmission. The results of the dose values are shown here for the 6 film samples. 2 depth profiling measurements are performed for each sample. Note that no helium could be detected in the pristine film as expected. Data demonstrate that an excellent data repeatability could be achieved for helium measurements in these film samples. The overlay of the depth profiles obtained on these samples, 1 run for each sample, is shown in this figure. Results obtained in the pristine tungsten sample showed that the detection limit around 6E17 atom per centimeter cube could be obtained, which corresponds to 10 ppm atomic density. Compared to other techniques commonly used for the analysis of nuclear materials, SIMS provides better sensitivity, wide dynamic range, and high depth resolution, adding to the fact that the impurity profile can be directly obtained without any mathematical treatment. The next example shows how dynamic SIMS can be applied to characterize the xenon noble gas in-depth distribution in a cerium oxide sample. Noble gases such as xenon can be either dissolved in a UO2 matrix at the position where they were created, in bubbles within the UO2 ceramic, or released in the gap between the fuel pellet and the cladding. The formation of bubbles induces swelling of the pellet, which increases the stress on the inner part of the cladding, potentially creating safety issues. Cerium dioxide is usually considered as a non-radioactive surrogate of UO2 ceramics, to simulate the properties of nuclear fuels during irradiation processes or long-term storage. A cerium-O2 disk was implanted with Xenon-129 ions and then annealed. Analyses in CO2 sample were performed on the CAMECA 7F02 using O2 plus primary ions at 10 keV impact energy and collecting positive secondary ions. A normal incident electron gun was used in order to avoid charging effects during sputtering. The duration of each depth profile analysis was around 20 minutes. Figure shows the Xenon depth profile obtained in this sample. An inset provides a zoom of the profile over a selected depth range. The curve shows a baseline signal with a Gaussian in-depth distribution typical of ion-implanted species. Interestingly, numerous signal spikes could be detected on top of this baseline signal. It should be mentioned that similar results were obtained for repeated measurements on different sample areas. To be noted that the cerium metric signal is monotonous without spikes, which rules out any instrumental issue. The baseline signal corresponds to dissolved xenon, whereas the signal spikes indicate the presence of gas bubbles expected to form during the annealing process. These results are in agreement with previous studies showing xenon bubble formation in irradiated nuclear fuel. On this sample, surface mapping of cerium and contaminant species has also been obtained by SIMS. Scanning and imaging analyses were performed using similar conditions as for depth profiling, but with a very small primary beam current in order to achieve a lateral resolution around 1 micron. The image field of view, which corresponds to the raster size, was set to 175 by 175 microns. Ion images were recorded for potassium, barium, and lanthanum contaminant species, as well as for cerium metric species. The acquisition time for each image was 80 seconds. On the cerium image, one can distinguish the crystalline contrast of grains due to the different sputtering rates, whereas the ion images for the contaminants show the accumulation of impurities as precipitates for potassium or dissolved species at grain boundaries for barium and lanthanum. Data shown for this sample illustrate some of the unique analytical advantages of dynamic SIMS, high sensitivity depth profiling, and ion imaging with sub-micron resolution. Next set of data focuses on the capability of dynamic SIMS to measure iodine at a very low concentration level in a silicon carbide sample. A silicon carbide matrix was selected because of the authorization issues with the use of UO2 in the lab where the analyses were performed. Iodine is a halogen with volatile and corrosive properties susceptible to induce stress corrosion cracking during pellet to cladding interactions. It is thus considered as a key element to be taken into account for safety assessment of nuclear materials. Low detection limits are needed because of the low content level in real samples. The silicon carbide sample was implanted with iodine 1 to 27 ions. Measurements of the iodine implanted in silicon carbide sample were performed on the CAMECA IMS 7F02 using cesium primary ions at 15 keV impact energy and collecting negative secondary ions. Normal incident electron gun was used for charge compensation. To start with, a mass spectrum analysis was first performed around the mass corresponding to the implanted iodine species, mass 127. Data show a complex mass spectrum with relatively high signal intensity at every mass unit, indicating the presence of mass interferences. In fact, when we compute the list of mass interferences near the mass of iodine 127, one can see that there are several close interferences involving the major matrix elements silicon and carbon. Classical high mass resolution conditions cannot be used in this case, as the required mass resolving power conditions cannot be achieved on the SIMS instrument. Could we use the energy filtering technique instead of high mass resolution conditions in order to remove molecular mass interferences? The energy filtering technique is based on the fact that the secondary ion energy distribution is narrower for polyatomic species compared to monoatomic species. We can see in this example that the energy distribution becomes narrower as the silicon cluster size increases. By moving the energy bandpass towards the high energy part of the distribution, either by applying an offset to the sample voltage or by moving mechanically the energy slit, it is possible to separate monoatomic from isobaric cluster ions. In this example, one can eliminate the large cluster ion silicon-4. This works well when the energy distribution of the isotope of interest is sufficiently different from those of the interfering molecular cluster. Therefore, it is possible to separate a monoatomic species from a large cluster composed of 4 atoms or more. It is the case for the iodine measurements in silicon carbide, so it should work. The main drawback of this method is the reduced transmission, as the energy bandpass is no longer centered on the maximum of the secondary ion energy distribution. In CAMECA IMS magnetic sector instruments, the energy bandpass can be adjusted to any width or position, low to high energy. The energy slit width and position can be adjusted continuously, and the slit is motorized in the last CAMECA IMS models. The energy filtering technique was then applied during depth profiling measurements of iodine in silicon carbide sample. A first depth profile analysis was performed with a centered energy bandpass, maximum transmission. Then other measurements were performed by shifting the energy slit. As expected, the transmission decreases with increasing shift. For 20 eV shift, the transmission is approximately 4 times lower compared to the conditions without shift. However, for the same shift, the background signal due to mass interferences decreases by almost 4 decades, proving that the mass interferences are efficiently removed. This results in an improvement of the detection limit of more than 3 decades, as indicated by the black arrow. This example shows that the energy filtering technique can be a powerful method for removal of polyatomic mass interferences when analyzing high-mass species such as iodine. This protocol provides a significant improvement of the depth profile dynamic range and thus of the detection limits. For this, a true bandpass filter is required, as available on magnetic sector mass spectrometers. Another important application of dynamic SIMS is the analysis of small uranium particles. A challenge of international nuclear safeguards is to verify the absence of undeclared nuclear activities. Particle analysis using SIMS was developed for safeguards purposes in order to characterize particles collected in nuclear facilities. Particles are collected by wiping smooth surfaces at various locations inside the nuclear facility using cotton cloths, referred as the swipe sample. Analysis of small particles from these dust samples contain elements like uranium, plutonium, and thorium. The isotope signature of these particles is a fingerprint of the specific process in the nuclear facility. It can give an insight on how nuclear materials are handled at a certain location. Particle analysis can also be used for nuclear forensic work. The goal in this case is to investigate not only the intended use of a material, but also its origin. Dynamic SIMS is a powerful technique for the analysis of micrometer-sized particles because of its high sensitivity, ion imaging capabilities, and precise isotope ratio measurement, among others. The SIMS technique is unique in that it is the only technique that can both localize the particles of interest and provide the uranium isotopic composition of single particles. The automatic search for uranium particles by SIMS has been greatly improved by the development of the Automated Particle Measurement Software, APM, by CAMECA. The software performs a two-dimensional image scan over a large surface of the sample, by combining ion imaging acquisition and a 2D scan of the stage movement. Then the image data are processed automatically using a specific algorithm. It provides the location of uranium particles as well as a first assessment of the enrichment for each particle. Large geometry SIMS instruments with multi-collection detection and better sensitivity are widely used for precise determination of the isotopic composition of single uranium particles, including minor isotopes. Besides the determination of the isotopic composition of uranium, recent studies using the 7F have focused on other topics such as age dating of individual micrometer-sized uranium particles. In the nuclear field, the age refers to the latest purification date. Having access to the purification date can give precious information on the history of a nuclear facility or nuclear material for safeguarding purposes. The 230 thorium-234 uranium chronometer is of major interest to measure the age of uranium. The purpose of this work was to develop a direct analysis that simultaneously gives access to the age and the isotopic composition of individual particles for samples that are a mixture of different nuclear materials. After locating the particles with the APM software, the analytical protocol was based on 2 successive microbeam analyses on individual particles for the determination of both the precise 235 uranium abundance and the model age. The combination of isotopic measurement and age determination is illustrated in this figure for a mixture of uranium particles coming from 3 different certified reference materials with a 235 uranium abundance ranging from 10% to 97%. SIMS measurements are shown by the full circles, and the blue bars indicate the certified data. The SIMS results are therefore in agreement with the results for individual CRM particles, which shows that this methodology can be successfully applied to a mixture of uranium particles. The dotted red circle shows estimated results corresponding to a bulk method, that is, the average isotopic ratio and age. ICP-MS and TIMS are the reference techniques used to obtain model ages. However, these techniques require ponderable amounts of samples, so the measured age is the mean of the ages of the different populations of nuclear materials, leading to a false value that would not match the real composition of the sample. The advantages of SIMS over other techniques is its high throughput and the capability to carry out age dating on individual particles of mixed samples. I would like now to conclude this talk. Data shown here illustrate some of the unique analytical advantages of the CAMECA IMS 7F or 7F Auto magnetic sector mass spectrometer design. High sensitivity for achieving low detection limits, depth profiling with high dynamic range, ion imaging with sub-micrometer resolution, isotope ratio measurements with high precision, true bandpass energy filter for removal of mass interferences, and rotating stage for minimizing roughness development in polycrystalline samples. The dynamic SIMS technique proves extremely useful for a wide range of nuclear science applications. Study of fission products behavior in nuclear materials or irradiated nuclear materials. Note that the shielded version of the magnetic sector IMS 6F instrument has been installed at CEA Cadarache in France and at ITU Karlsruhe in Germany for the characterization of irradiated nuclear fuels. Other applications include the characterization of plasma-facing materials in fusion devices, investigation of long-term behavior of nuclear materials for safe waste disposal, uranium isotope analysis on environmental samples collected from nuclear handling facilities, as shown before, and study of uranium accumulation processes in human tissues and cells. Some of the results shown in this talk have been published in a proceedings paper of the SIMS 21 International Conference. To finish, I would like to thank again all my co-authors that kindly agreed to present their data in this talk. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me at this email address. Thank you so much for your attention. Goodbye.